I'm being recorded. There's my consent. A little bit about wilderness medicine and how I got into climate change and health and how I think they're related. I'll share a story with you because I think it kind of helps set the stage. We'll talk about science communication and climate change and health effects. What are we doing with it? And then conclusions. Um, So I got started in my career early. Was in New York City. I got my train there. I was there for 9/11, and it was a crazy time to be there. And we started off at Weill Cornell Medical College as my career. I was interested in wilderness medicine. It was sort of the idea of remote and austere care. How do you take care of people in crazy places? And I thought it was a great way to educate. I was excited to emphasize the physical exam in a place that was very, like probably where you all are training, big tertiary care hospitals with lots of resources. And it was upstate New York. And so we would go to the Adirondacks, beautiful in the fall. And then in the spring, we would go out west to the American Southwest. And it was great. And then if you've ever been to New York City, we had kids. And so immediately, whatever we loved about New York became pretty much a liability. But we were lucky to come out to Colorado, where I started here in 2012 at the University of Colorado and kind of took all our best ideas and brought them out to start a program in wilderness medicine. You can see here if you're interested, there's our website. We do all sorts of stuff like teach wilderness medicine courses for students and physicians and lay people. And so we do a lot of wilderness medicine courses. We do work with the 10th Mountain Huts, so the high altitude huts. We run a little wellness ski patrol and, think about keeping people safe in high altitude and very cold environments. We do work in polar medicine. We do some training for the University of the Arctic, which is a consortium of schools invested in the circumpolar north. And I'll tell you a little bit why we're invested in that as well. We have a diploma in mountain medicine course that we run with some of our colleagues. And this is a real technical skills course. If you're interested, again, and we can tell you where you can do it with us or you can do it with other colleagues in the Wilderness Medical Society, but things like high angle rope rescues, real technical things for active practitioners in the field. And then we have something called a remote medicine service, which is, we say if you're doing business or ops in places like this, where you need to think about how do we bring best practice medicine to places that are very far and remote from definitive care programs. And this has all led us, and Chilpy, it's kind of cool that you're interested in all this stuff because we're going to talk about all this stuff, is we do work for the Human Research Program for NASA, thinking about exploration medical capability, which basically is thinking of, again, remote, austere medicine. How do we think about what could happen, common things, treating common things, and then those things that are high consequence, low incidence, those things that you don't happen very much, but when they do, you have got to be prepared for them. And then helping our friends at the places like the Everest Base Camp Medical Clinic, and this is in Nepal. For a while, we were the medical directors for the EMS, the pre-hospital providers, the EMTs at the U.S. Antarctic Program, and then we flipped to the National Science Foundation's Polar North Program. And then this is the clinic that we run. This is Summit Station. It's on the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. And while we were there, there's when you're working there, you work with all these earth scientists who are bringing back this incredible data on climate change and degradation. And so along the way, it was one of those things where as wilderness physicians, we were like, hey, we're in these places. They're these beautiful remote ecosystems that are being under stress from climate change. And then we began to think about, why aren't we thinking about this as well? Why aren't we a part of this? And adding to the science. And so in 2008, my mentor at the time, he was chair at Stanford, wrote this very elegant, great to read right now. It's a 2-pager in JAMA, Physicians in the Environment. And frankly, it was just, why should we care? And I thought that was very powerful. So I wrote my own op-ed in an equally prestigious journal, Wilderness and Environmental Medicine. And I spoke about why I thought, we should care, and began to think about the the historic, I made the historic parallel with the Cold War and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and how basically how nuclear proliferation was one of those things where it was an existential crisis where no one felt empowered to really do anything about it. And it was hyper politicized. And I put this here because I put lessons from Dr. Strangelove, and a lot of the students I talked to were like, Strangelove. Now, who was that? Was he in lab? Was he someone? And so this was a famous movie about the absurdity of nuclear war, and how basically this was a one of the sorry, I can't move my slides forward. And how basically the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War got together and said, nuclear war is the final epidemic with no meaningful cure. And basically, I thought that there was a historic parallel there. And then because they won the Nobel Prize, that was something that I thought was a good parallel. So, I want to talk about a case with you guys. And you can see here in September 2017, a Category 5 hurricane slammed into Puerto Rico, maximum sustained winds 175 miles an hour. And you can see here, Puerto Rico was a home to 3.1 million Americans, worst natural disaster in recorded history to affect the island, the 10th most intense Atlantic hurricane on record. So very devastating to a vulnerable community there. Widespread damage, you can see here, huge power outages, structural damage, communities cut off, big food insecurity. And so the medical examiner for the Commonwealth basically came forth and said, okay, here was a tropical hurricane that slammed into Puerto Rico. The official death toll, 64, right? So this was something that was really concerning to a lot of people. They're saying, yeah, this doesn't make sense. This is super low numbers. We're not so sure that this is actually true. So back up earlier that year in this was 2017, we had just started a science and health policy fellowship at the University of Colorado. And you can see here, we had some basic competencies, right? So knowledge of US, of scientific foundations, who's doing what in the US government, who's doing what in international, and then health implications of climate change, and understanding, how to measure it and things like that. This was basically our effort to train physician leaders in the field. And so we had just started this and had our first fellow moving forward with it. And we were lucky because we were underwritten by a local Denver foundation, the Living Closer Foundation, and had good partners in the US government. We had the CDC and the NIHS who were saying, hey, this is great. We love your fellows. We want to work closely with you and get them, operating and working with us. And so back to Hurricane Maria, this was about, a lot of people began to think about that were in US government began to think about, hey, this is kind of messed up. This is something that, we can't talk about people in the government, but they said, hey, they reached out to our friends at Harvard, who we do work with, and a local Puerto Rican university, and said, hey, can you guys look into this? You guys are in academia. You know epidemiology, disaster response, and understand why the excess mortality of this disease was so low. So we sent our fellow along with others, and then had partners in Puerto Rico and boots on the ground, and looked at the different barrios and in Puerto Rico, and did frankly a public health survey on excess mortality. And here was our results. And you can see here, it was a bell curve. It was wide. It was about 800 to 8,000, because we couldn't get all the, you had to spend a lot of time there to get big numbers. But this is what we came up with, 4645, very different than 64. We knew this would be under a tremendous amount of scrutiny. We had very smart people at Harvard crunch the numbers for us and be very transparent with our data. And we knew this would be a lightning rod, and it was. So our friend Sherry Fink broke the news in the New York Times. This was the Tuesday after Memorial Day. So this was the fall, happened in the fall, and this came out the following spring. It hit the New York Times and then the front page of the Washington Post. So this was, this was kind of a big deal. And then crazy happens. And I share this with you because this is the one of those lessons we want to talk about is the communication of science. And you can see here. So we had the number, the mean 4645. And then Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren all started tweeting about this. And then Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Gina Haspel, the CIA director, started making fun of our methods. And then the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico had black hats printed that said 4645. And the New York, their people were marching in New York City with 4645 as the number, when in fact it was a range of numbers, and we knew that. But so things kind of took on a life of their own. And by the perverse metric of science in today's world, we had a presidential tweet, came a little bit later, sort of saying that this was wrong. 3,000 people did not die, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a surreal thing to have been involved with, but this was the answer, right? This is what we were looking for. The Puerto Rican ordered to release the death records, which all we wanted was transparency and to understand the impact of a tropical cyclone, a climate-fueled disease, on excess mortality. In some ways, just to shine a flashlight on it, right? That was the whole goal of this. And so the Wall Street Journal came up. We were starting to get some press from this and they wrote an article that said, hey, med schools are training to push doctors for climate change and health. And we thought this was quite exciting. And you can see here the final sentence of it was, the University of Colorado Department of Emergency Medicine now offers a fellowship for physicians on climate change and health policy. This is exciting. We were getting accolades from all over. We were feeling quite chuffed with ourselves and knew we had sort of been onto something. It was proof of concept, if you will. But then something different happened. The Wall Street Journal came back with a op-ed from a dean at Penn, and you can see here, quite inflammatory. It's, take 2 aspirin and call me by my pronouns. If the country needs more gun control and climate change activists, med schools are not the right place to produce them. And then doubling down on that, the editorial board said, left-wing medical Twitter, I wonder if any of you are involved there. Yes, there is such a thing. And said patients want an accurate diagnosis, not a lecture on social justice or climate change. So that's the end of this little vignette. And I put this here because I suspect, you guys are listening to this lecture, you signed up for it. So maybe I know where you are, maybe I don't. But it's not like this is a great idea, we just need to move it forward. It's actually in some ways still controversial. And I think you have to think about that in terms of where do you sit on this curve, and how active do we need to be in medicine? So I think I know where you sit on that, but again, it's something that needs to be talked about. So what I want to do now is pivot and talk about climate and health science, and talk about the physical science, because you can't really understand the health effects until we do that. This is the part where you're going to see a lot of this. You see a lot of curves. So if you want to tune out, it's probably okay, but that's really this next part of the lecture. When I think about what the impact of climate change on human health is, I always, and even when I give interviews, I pull up this chart. It's from the CDC. It's very elegant. You can find it anywhere. Just Google CDC climate change. And that inner circle is the drivers of climate change. Some say there should be 3, 3 or 4. Rising temperatures, extreme weather, sea level rise, increasing carbon dioxide. That next circle is the earth science effects, and the rectangle, of course, is the human health effects. But it's really an elegant representation of climate change and human health in a nutshell. So it's just kind of my go-to if I'm trying to show this in one slide. It's from the CDC. We put up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change here because that's where a lot of the best physical science lives. They're coming out with a new report very soon. The truth is that no one is really arguing about this anymore. Climate change is human caused. It's our fault, and it's been happening since the 1850s. And you can see here's atmospheric carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa. The zigzags are for the different the seasonal changes. So as the The boreal summer blooms, all the leaves suck up carbon dioxide, and of course there's less landmass in the southern hemisphere. So that's the zigzag. But there's no mystery as to the overall trend in terms of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The science for this is awesome. It actually comes out of the ice cores of the two places in the planet where snow really doesn't melt, and that's Greenland and Antarctica. So as snow falls on snow, falls on snow, air gets trapped, more air in snow, and that turns into ice, and that air basically is still there. So they basically, it's kind of like a tree ring phenomenon where they pull the ice out and they sample the air way down deep, and you're basically sampling the air from 800,000 to 2 million to 1.2 million years ago. Kind of cool. All this lives in Denver, where I live, and we can take our students there. And it's really just this awesome place, a repository of science, and you can actually see this ice core. I, was a little skeptical when I went there. I sort of thought it would be one of those things where you get there, you see the ice, kind of look around, and you're like, okay, where's the gift shop? But these guys are awesome, and they give great tours, and they talk about the science with passion. You get to walk into a room that's 40 below, and then you may say Celsius or Fahrenheit, you ask, but actually it's the one temperature where Fahrenheit and Celsius are the same. So it's obviously freezing in there. And here's some ice I was holding that's 2 million years old. If it was a rock, go outside and pick up a rock, it's a billion years old, but ice is different. So that was actually really cool to be able to see that and talk to these guys about it. And you can see here in this chart, there's good science that goes back even a half more, 1.2 million years, where people talk about the fluctuations in carbon in carbon dioxide over eons, right? We don't really know, right? It fluctuates. Well, no, we actually do know, and you can see here, you don't need to know anything about math to see the asymptotic change in the last 150 years when we can go back to 1.2 million years, and you can see the different fluctuations, the ancient little ice age and things like that. But there's the data really tells us the story. All top 10 warmest years on record, all since 2005. Lowest record sea ice extent. So this is September of 2012 was the lowest. It's also getting thinner. So the coverage is lower, and the ice is getting thinner. And here's the record low maximum. So that point in the winter where it should be the biggest was at its lowest point in 2017. You can see here again, this is from a recent report from the IPCC on the cryosphere, so the frozen parts of the planet, is that the coverage is lower and the ice sheet mass is lower. And what does this mean? It means sea level rise, right? This is very simple science for an eighth grader, right? You take an ice cube, you calculate the cube, and you melt it, and you can predict how high the water level in the beaker goes, right? So it's the same thing, and the science is actually quite easy. And you can see here, storm surge. This is from the Miami Herald just a couple days ago, right? Flooding in the streets. I don't know if you guys saw that personally, but it's one of those things where it's going to happen with storm surges at first, and then outright just sea level rise is going to put millions worldwide at threat. Here are predictions from sea level rise for American cities, and then here's another projection up to 2100. And unfortunately, a lot of the data has borne out that we're at the over the last 15 years, the predictions we're on the higher end of that. So again, you can just see here what that means to coastal cities is going to be devastating. We can see here that pH is changing. And so most of the carbon dioxide that is produced by industrial processes is not actually in the atmosphere. It's actually sequestered in the oceans. And from chemistry, when you take carbon dioxide and shove it into a chemical equation, right, that's going to change pH. And so the oceans are becoming more acidic, and that's undermining our food chains. It's thought to be causal for some of the coral reef bleaching, and is undermining maritime food security and protein yields for food. So this is a big deal, and we still are trying to understand the consequences of it. Global water cycle will not be uniform. Dry places will be drier, wet places will be wetter. There's often pockets of extreme cold. So you can see here July record chill temperatures in different places. Chicago Tribune a few years ago, is this the worst winter ever? Newfoundland, a monster blizzard just happened last year, hadn't happened before. And this is where we get snowballs on the floor of the Senate. How can it be cold outside? Or sorry, how can there be climate change when it's so cold outside, right? So it doesn't make sense. And this is where we can trip up in the challenge of science communication. There's a lot of people here who say, so sorry to back up. You have to understand, right? And this is one of those key points from this lecture. It's not like you take a heat lamp and put on a lump of clay and you have a warmer lump of clay, right? We're adding energy to a complex system. And that isn't just a warmer system, it's a more energetic, unpredictable system. So a lot of people say global warming, we should have never called it that. We should have gone with global energizing. And then the climate change communication folks are, no, don't say that. It's way too optimistic. Let's go with global weirding. And that comes from Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech, who gives a great podcast on this. So I think that's a very apropos moniker for what we're dealing with. So if you still don't get this, I did a little experiment looking at the most complex system I knew. My daughter was much younger at the time. And I said, okay, look, let's have her. She's a planet, right? Very complex system. And let's see what happens when we add energy to a complex system. So I said, all right, let's take some colored concentrated sugar and dump it in. And at first we saw a very, linear relationship, right? A hyper-energetic child doing super physiologic feats of strength. But then something crazy happened. We saw paradoxical hypersomnolence, erratic behavior, well beyond 2 standard deviations from the norm, right? So everyone gets this. Everyone gets a toddler on sugar. It's not a more energetic, direct relationship. It's crazy town. And that's what climate change is. So hopefully that's something you can explain to your friends and family when they're trying to understand this. All right, so let's pivot for a second to the health effects, because we kind of went over, that's a crash course in climate change 101, and here are the health effects. So right now we know that climate change is a threat multiplier. It's making pre-existing health problems worse, right? It's a threat multiplier. But as these things accelerate and increase, it will be delivering ill health outright in and of itself, especially in places where developing countries, right, where they have poor governance and poverty, right? So this is another big, great theme from this lecture, is that climate change is a disease of poverty and a disease of vulnerability, right? So think about that as we move forward here. You can see here, the old bell curve is your sort of historic weather pattern, and that flatter bell curve is the new weather. So I don't know, can you guys see my cursor here? If I'm sharing my screen. So, okay, yeah, cool. So this part here, this is your old weather. This is your 2 weeks of your heat wave in the summer. But now those 2 weeks is now 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks. And that's your plate. The place you live is much hotter. But this is really concerning, this red tail, because this is heat well beyond any historical experience. And that's where people get into trouble. And that's what happened in the UK or in Northern Europe in 2003, where 30,000 people perished in a resource-rich part of the world. But no one knew it was time to check in on the elderly who lived in the 5th floor walk-up, or have cooling centers opened, or AC, or public health announcements. And it caught them totally off guard. For a full week, the temperature was above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, which is to say that climate change didn't cause this period. It's to say that climate change will be causing more extreme heat events well beyond historical experience, and it'll catch even resource-rich places off guard. Heat is a threat, right? Heat is a health threat, right? For each 1 degree increase in summer temperatures, look at the death rate for diabetes, heart attacks, lung disease, heart failure. This data is really hard to come by because, on a hot day, you zip across the parking lot at the grocery store, you feel your pulse is going to go up. That may be enough for an elderly person on oxygen to kind of push them over the edge. So, and it's particularly concerning in places where you can't cool off, like urban areas that are a lot of blacktop that have something called the urban heat island effect, which we know can add 7 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit compared to green space surrounding. So those heat waves will be much, much worse in the city, in the blacktop areas, particularly without green space. And that's where a lot of the poor people end up living. And here's a great study that looked at those red line neighborhoods. I don't know if you know anything about this, but it was a historic anomaly from the New Deal where it was caught up with socioeconomic neighborhoods there were red lines drawn around them, and so they looked at these historic neighborhoods that had been the banks, based on bank loans, there was thought to be some discrimination there, and you can see here that the poor neighborhoods had much higher heat stress. So again, a disease or exposures of vulnerability, in this case, socioeconomic vulnerability. We've seen this again in a paper that we did in Central America. We saw climate change in the chronic kidney disease. So field workers in Guatemala and El Salvador are having chronic kidney disease show up in their 30s and 40s from extreme heat exposure. So very devastating to this population. We've seen it again in Sri Lanka by colleagues who are doing work there. So vulnerable field workers getting exposed to extreme heat. Other crazy weather, hyper-energized weather systems hold more energy and hold more moisture, so you're having extreme downpours. One of the great Bradbach principles of public health is we go to the bathroom here, we eat our food here, and we live here, we grow our food here, and we keep them separate. Heavy downpours mixes all of this stuff up. And in places with very tenuous sewers and public health infrastructure, this becomes basically an issue of water insecurity. We saw this in New York City. You knew you didn't drink the water after a heavy downpour for 10 or 15 minutes because the pumps would be overrun. And so, this is, and worldwide, this is an extreme health threat, because under 5 years old, diarrhea is still one of the leading causes of mortality. When all that water, warm water, picks up nutrients and dumps into warm bodies of water, algae, which had been normally it exists everywhere, but in microscopic doses, you see logarithmic growth, and it can absolutely overwhelm ecosystems, causing havoc. Now, this isn't huge public health threat where it kills tens of thousands of people a year, but it does affect scores of people a year. Hepatotoxins, pulmonary toxins, neurotoxins, leading to diseases like amnestic shellfish poisoning, which sounds like a horrible soap opera plot, but it's really quite devastating it's like almost stroke-like symptoms to the memory centers of your brain, and these people really struggle. So again, it's from harmful algal blooms where the toxins from algae, which are normally microscopically undetectable, just again proliferate and just completely overwhelm ecosystems. We've seen this last summer and fall, wildfires increasing duration, increasing in intensity, and then of course it degrades air quality for huge swaths of parts of America. So big deal for people on oxygen, COPD, asthma, pregnant children, a big deal. One of the more intuitive things, vector-borne disease, we're seeing, if you're familiar with this, like those of you in Miami, it's tropical or pretty much tropical. So you'll see, you're familiar with this, but huge parts of the US are not, as are parts of the world. And now these historically naive populations are now having exposure to malaria, chikungunya, dengue, and Lyme disease, higher in altitude and higher in elevations. And, it just makes sense, right? Mosquitoes love warm weather, bugs love warm weather, and they're having more time to thrive and have more reproductive cycles within those time periods. We know disasters caused by weather and climate are going up. This data comes from the reinsurance industry. So it's the insurers to insurance companies. And long ago, they're just like, look, this is not political or controversial to us. We're going to charge you more money to their clients, and here's why. And they just laid out the data to explain why they had a market-based rationale to charge their clients more money. And it was because of climate-fueled weather events. And we've seen this more and more. The hurricane season is still churning along, and in October 2012, the largest storm ever recorded, it stopped being a hurricane when it hit the Northeast, Hurricane Sandy, and it was a big weather blob. But I put this here because this is where I trained. It's Bellevue Hospital in NYU. And Bellevue is the hospital for the homeless, the immigrants, the prisoners. There's no locks on the door. It's the vulnerability. It's the safety net hospital. And in the most resource-rich place in the world, arguably, New York City, a storm surge came up the East River, flooded both of these hospitals, knocked out their power offline, and huge parts of the medical system were cut off for 6 to 12 months. And so I put this slide here because it's just an issue of vulnerability, right? In the most resource-rich place in the world, the safety net hospital was knocked offline, and people said, well, those people, they could get care. They could go to another hospital. Well, if you know anything, you guys are med students, you know that, emergency care is very different. No one pays attention to your blood pressure management or your diabetic management or sending A1Cs, right? And so, no, it's really, there was a huge toll in morbidity that I don't think ever got accounted for. Now, this guy is our nemesis, right? Because he's a Greenlandic farmer, and they're killing it in Greenland. They're growing stuff they've never grown before, and they're like, this is awesome. It's gonna be great for us, climate change. And if you're a Canadian or a Russian farmer, you might say the same thing. But remember, the yields that they may have for warmer temperatures, they're not getting more sunlight, so that's a thing. And by no means will it make up for the decrease in agricultural productivity for the tropics and subtropics and temperate areas. And if you know anything about geography, think about where the more vulnerable people in the world live, the poorer countries, and you can see almost a direct correlation, right? So the net hit to food security will be very impactful from climate change. And then, I think that to me, that's one of the biggest health issues, because you think about undernutrition, malnutrition, and the consequences that, particularly for kids, that lasts over a lifetime of poor health. We know the fisheries are taking a hit too. A lot of this has to do with overfishing, but the climate effects as well are going to hammer the 30% of the world who gets most of their protein from the oceans. So again, big hits to food security. And as we look forward, we know that displacement is going to be a big deal. In wilderness medicine, we love bagging peaks. People go to the wilderness conferences and talk about the peaks that they just bagged that summer. I was up in Everest, or I did Denali. It was awesome. But if you really want to bag a cool peak, go to the Maldives. You can stand on a chair and you'll be at the summit of the Maldives, right? And so that's just a funny way of saying that these are very vulnerable places for sea level rise, and that we know by the middle of this century, at the end, it's very likely that these nations will be underwater, and they're actually resettling now in Australia and New Zealand. And so lots of displacement. And then places of poor governance, remember, threat multiplier, particularly with poverty and poor governance, are going to be stressed even further. And there's a great study that these guys did here, looking at the Levant, so Syria and Lebanon, suggesting that it's suffering the worst drought in over 900 years. And that we think that farmers leaving desiccated farmlands, moving into the cities, into the tinderbox that became the Syrian civil war, just sort of added fuel to the fire. So we'll finish this part with a very sobering slide from our friend Kirk Smith, which reminds us just of the vulnerability, the disproportionate impact that climate change has. Okay, so what are we doing with this? Where do we go from here? So I think we have an exceptional opportunity to use the power of science communication to talk to not just our patients, but our friends and family, the people who think you're the smartest person in the room because you're a med student. I mean, we know different, but they don't. And really reframe the climate change dialogue, get away from polar bears on icebergs and move towards kids with inhalers, and frame this as a health issue. Because the truth is, we haven't done that great with altruism. Save the whales, love Mother Earth. I mean, I love whales, I love my mom, but it's a different hierarchy of needs when you talk about health. And the same thing with abstracts. Oh my God, we just hit 412 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Like, that may mean something to you guys. It means nothing to most people, and yet those are the headlines. It's important for science, but it's a different thing than science communication, right? So I think we have to sort of think about what our goals are in that regard, and think about the risk of our parents' risk of chronic lung disease and our kids' risk of asthma. I put this up here. This is Maybach's Pentad. Ed Maybach from George Mason put this up, I guess a couple years ago now, and he's like, here's how we communicate this. It's very simple. There's 5 steps. It's real, meaning it's happening. It's us, human caused. Experts agree. Pick the experts that your people are going to listen to. It's bad, meaning there's consequences from it. There's health effects, but there's hope, and there's a million ways to spin this. I thought this was great. I called it Maybach's Pentad, being in medicine. I thought this would get retweeted left and right. I don't think anyone retweeted it. You guys can go find it and retweet it. That'd be appreciated. Thank you. And so in the old days, in 2012, we thought, okay, what would this curriculum look like? How do we teach this? How do we disseminate it? And, we realized there was no curriculum. So we said, okay, look, if we're going to write a curriculum, we might as well write the textbook. And so we put a book together, and this was great. And like any good lecturer, I'll push my second book coming out. It's coming out December 28th. It's a textbook. And so it's big, but it basically, we think it's the current state of the art of like, what is climate change and health? But that really couldn't be the end of it, because then you guys came up and said, hey, we read your book. And I immediately knew they were lying, because no one can read a book of that size. It was too big. It's a textbook. No one can read it. And so we said, okay, we have to rethink how we're going to communicate this. And so remember that guy Auerbach at the beginning who wrote that essay in JAMA? We wrote this book, we made up the name, Enviromedics. And we really wanted to take a visceral approach and say, this is sickness. We're doctors. We know sickness. And we put a lot of vignettes in here. It was the hottest day of the year in the South Bronx, and Sally ran out of her inhaler. It never used to happen, but now the weather's been so hot, she's been having a flare every day, and it finally got bad. And we began to talk about, this is what it's like to intubate an 11-year-old, give that visceral feel. There was our emergency medicine composites that we put in there, just to sort of share that, like the consequences and the impact. Really take the reader to the bedside. Moving forward here, we put together a consortium. We got together with earth scientists and public health officials and physicians from different disciplines, and said, hey, we got to start collaborating, because this is a multi-sector collaboration to think about climate and health. And we began to do work with the School of Public Health and put symposia on. I told you about the fellowship that we started, and we began to pick up partners with the Nature Conservancy and NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is out here in Colorado, and thinking about scaling up fellowships for physicians to, again, train leaders in the field. And then this past year, our med school, we're going to start we've just started a climate and health program, which is going to be focused on education and outreach, and like really pushing this stuff out there. And you can see here, there's lots of stuff that we want to do. It's a lot of it's education, but even something as cool as a carbon offset program, which we have pitched, but of course, no one's flying now, so it wasn't the right time to dig into that. And then leaning into our other partners that are doing lots of great work on this. So I'll share these slides with you, Shilpi, but there's just tons of people who are, Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and even Columbia, which is becoming a repository for educational material. We think, I don't know, we're calling this climate medicine, and I'm not sure that's even a thing. We're trying to define it and understand it, but we think it's a thing. And it's basically the clinician's take on climate change and health, and all the different pathophysiologic effects and societal effects that are going to be um, encompass this. And so we think of like, what is an agenda for climate medicine look like? And we have something coming out next month in health affairs. But you think about, okay, what can we do on campus in training and outreach and med students and cranky orthopedic surgeons who don't want to do any of this but are kind of interested, and undergrads, and getting everyone trained up and thinking about this. And then how do we affect our clinical practice by doing green infrastructure projects and policy statement and having journal space and society engagement. And then on our in our hospitals, which anywhere between 12 to 15% of carbon emissions is health related. The healthcare sector is 18.5% of GDP. So huge impact. And, this is a bit of putting our money where our mouth is and, leading by example. I just want to kind of put a couple of things out here about COVID, because we had to sort of think about that. So, COVID and climate change, some parallels in that, this is a public health issue characterized by lack of preparation and coordination, thought to have dire economic consequences and a disproportionate burden falling on communities of color and vulnerable communities. But we've also seen a historic mobilization of resources with stimulus packages and accelerated development with huge sums of money of diagnostic and treatments. So in some ways, we know we can do this. The economy is recovering, at least until hopefully we'll get some vaccines out soon. So it's almost a sense of like, we've been through this, we can do it. And if we need to shift sectors of our economy to head off another disaster, it's not as foreign as it was, say, a year ago. And really have, a historic opportunity to invest in renewables and think about resilient supply chains and climate smart cities, and frankly, decarbonizing the economy, and along the same way, address some of these issues of environmental injustice in our communities that we know are there, and advance human capital and human dignity in the same effort. So I think there's a real possibility that we might be able to change some of the narratives. That's the optimistic view, of course. So just wrapping this up, how do we frame all this as a health threat? We talked about climate change as a disease of infections, respiratory disease, food insecurity, waterborne illness, heat stress, mental illness, displacement, and trauma. But when we think about the story we talked about in Puerto Rico, the flooding we've seen in the major American cities where the communities have been flooded and displaced, and then the wildfires in places like California. When I give my elevator pitch, I say, look, this is two things. It's a disease of vulnerability and disasters. And that's it in a nutshell. And I think that that's something that hopefully you can carry with you. This is all about changing our risk assessment. So we become thoughtful professionals that can have a dialogue on energy choices, the importance of clean air, why the loss of biodiversity undermines human health, the importance of water security, and the ravages of extreme weather events. Because when people talk about, love Mother Earth, the truth is Mother Earth will do fine. Life was teeming when the parts per million of carbon dioxide was in the 800s, eons ago. But it's really the Homo sapiens, right, that we'll have to worry about. And hopefully that's a good thing, because then that can be a stronger imperative, a stronger fulcrum for change, right? So how will history remember us? Will we be the era of the great procrastination, where people look back and say they had all the information they needed and nothing happened? It was all there, all the data was there, nothing happened. Or and I'm pulling from emergency medicine here. We can think about how we reacted in the early 40, 50 years ago, when emergency medicine arose in the 1960s to fill a need within the worsening healthcare crisis in America. We picked the hourglass as a symbol for a novel type of care provider schooled in the rapid delivery of care. And I think that that's a very apt and unique perspective to suggest that we can adapt in medicine. We've done it before. Um, and again, it's a great symbol to suggest that we should all act as if we're running out of time. So I want to thank the people who helped me do this. And I will happily take questions. We got about 10 minutes. So thanks, everybody.
Yay. Dr. Lemery, that was an awesome talk. Thank you so much. So prior to this lecture, actually, I was posed with the question of why physicians should even be involved in this sphere to begin with. And Tara has the exact verbiage of the question, but I think your talk today did a phenomenal job kind of explaining exactly why. And I can only speak for myself and hopefully the rest of my attendees that you've definitely inspired the way in which we approach our discourse on climate change, especially as future physicians. So thank you so much for your time. And with that, Tara is gonna kind of help moderate the Q&A. So yeah, thank you.
Great, yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I know you definitely touched on it. Could you like give one big sum up to like why physicians instead of climate specialists and scientists, why physicians should be engaged in this work and like instead of just leaving it up to the scientists, something we could walk away with?
Yeah, I mean, we translate science all the time, right? You know, we say to our patients, you need to take this medicine and explain why. You know, you need to have this surgery. We explain why. And, you know, we hold the public trust. Second opinions notwithstanding, you guys see this. Like our patients say, okay, doc, right? And, you know, so we do this all the time. And we're also we're scientists connected with a community. Most of us are not funded researchers. So I don't have to be very careful with what I say because I have to be within, you know, I have to be within that scientific uncertainty where science comes from. I can stare at you and say, look, I'm not going to wait to render care to my patient because I think they're getting sicker because I don't have all the information I need when I know I can keep them out of the ICU. I can let them go home and be well with their family. We are very comfortable looking at all the data, making assumptions and acting on it. And I think society generally respects us for that. You know, we have that white coat that we wear. So I think, you know, we're the perfect people to say, look, you know, if we wait until we have all the data that a lot of people demand that we have, you know, it's going to be a desert outside, you know, and we're not going to have any food and our cities will be underwater. So no, we're not going to wait. I think we have met all the science we need to tell us that it's time to act. We know this is a health threat. Now, with that said, you know, you have to be careful about policy. I don't want to go too far into prescribing policy. I'm not a policy expert. I'm a health expert. So I will stand in front of anyone and explain that this is a health issue and this is a risk. And then my hope is that everyone will believe that this is a problem, and then we can have meaningful conversations on policy. But when half the country doesn't think this is a problem or think that there's anything to fix, to me, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Is there any, I'd like to open the floor to any questions from those who attended. If you want to unmute your mic and ask your question, this is the time.
So in regards to policy and climate change, you said that your goal is to reframe the narrative and to get people to care more about both prevention and climate change together. It seems as though people put more stock in reactive medicine. So if this approach doesn't work, what would be your backup approach or your suggestion for us to continue this fight?
I mean, it's a great question. I think that's the essence of this. I think you just have to find, you know, you think about who you're talking to and what they care about. You know, find, you know, stories change things. So create your narrative, tell a story. You know, the story I brought up was for med students, but I could easily say, you know, I love that lake. I love going swimming in that lake. Remember the place we used to go as kids? Yeah, it's kind of, well, it's, you know, full of seaweed now, and it seems hotter, and and then the wildfires, you can't go there half the summer now. Doesn't that suck? Should we talk about that? Why do you think that is? And and try to connect with people over stories and be like, well, here's what I think. The data is actually pretty good, and um, uh, and so I think you have to be creative, and you use all your tools of persuasion to the degree that you feel comfortable using, and be a good science communicator. If someone doesn't get it, you do this every day in life. Like, if you don't get what you want, okay, well, how about overcoming from this angle or that angle? But I think, again, I go back to Ed's 5 points, and there's much bigger documents that are out there to talk about science communication. But I think it's being consistent with the messaging, unambiguous. Nah, it's actually data's there. Well, we don't really know. It's historic fluctuations, right? Like, no, not really. And here's why. We know that people don't like, just because you're smart and well-read doesn't mean anything. So again, I think we do have a chance by the job we have, by wearing that white coat. And I think people generally still trust us. So I think that's the angle we should default to.
When we're talking about, oh, sorry, I forgot my camera was off. When we're talking about food security being like a huge thing, and who's impacted really by the climate health situation, and it's all poor people, and we're looking at basically the way we produce food and the contaminants involved in that process. Is that something that y'all are considering looking at addressing, in terms of, like, when you look at farmers and what they're exposed to? I'd put a question about, like, the nephropathy being involved with heat, but also potential chemical exposure for people who are working in ag, because poor people are just trying to survive and trusting more well-to-do people, which I would assume would be us, or some of us may have come from some pretty bad backgrounds, but they're subject to just survival. And so it is the people who have the capacity to think and understand science that are responsible. And then some people who understand science still want money. So I find, like, with farmers who are willing to grow organically, it's more because of money than because they have any kind of core belief in environmental protection. And so how do we really advocate for environmental protection, even though the earth will survive without us, aside from making human health an incentive to protect the planet?
I mean, it's a great question, right? I mean, people have to feed their families. I think that's the hierarchy of needs I think we have to understand. Yeah, farmers will be exposed, as we change the nutrients in food. Processed foods are cheap, but they also increase NCDs, right? We're seeing this all over the world now, right? Non-communicable diseases, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. So we see that, we're seeing that a lot. And also, as farmland becomes more exhausted and stressed from climate, particularly drought, they're going to be pumping more pesticides and more fertilizers. And we know, organophosphate poisonings could anecdotally go up. And these are just, these are things we can just surmise by the fact that, by the trends that we're seeing. So, to your point, yeah, I mean, I think we have to some ways reprioritize things. If we wait for the market to fix things, we're losing time, which is why I think I'm a big fan of investing in renewables. There's lots of good economic data to say that it's a good investment for the country, but the faster we can have wind and solar and batteries be cheaper than carbon fuels. In some places they actually are becoming that, but there's no reason we shouldn't tip that over the edge and accelerate that, just so people can still, I mean, I'm not certainly suggesting we get away from a market. I mean, the market's how people make a living, right? But at the same point, there are things you can do, and we have done historically in our country to affect that. There's been lots of things we've done. that are historic parallels to that. So
Thank
I don't
you.
know if I answered the question. Yeah.
Dr. Lemery, thank you for your talk. My name is Jonathan Brandon. I'm sorry my video doesn't work. I'm a senior resident at Jackson in Miami in emergency medicine. And I was thinking about throughout your talk how I could, bring this to the patient when I have that interaction. And, as you discussed, being a good science communicator. And I think a good corollary for this is probably talking about vaccinations. I regularly find myself talking to parents about why they should vaccinate their children. And, it seems sometimes so far-fetched to them, but it's the same. I think this is the same conversation with why they, what our expectation of the world as we know it is a function of vaccines, and the fact that we expect our kids to grow up is the same. I think the same thing that we're kind of dealing with now with climate science. And I thought that was like an interesting thing for the clinician, where they could maybe find that one moment, just kind of maybe put a hint into their thought process.
I mean, that's great. Yeah, we all have to sort of think about what the appropriateness of interjecting any public health messaging into a patient interaction is. I know in the emergency room, it can be typically challenging, but it's there. I mean, people say, how do you do it? I'm like, well, sometimes you don't, but sometimes you can, particularly in Denver, you have the bad air quality days from the wildfires. That's an easy one. Extreme heat, really hot days. It's another easy one. So it's one of those things. I think if you're educated and you feel empowered, you'll know. But I think that's the first step. And I'm glad you guys are here, so we can, hopefully spark you or continue your education into this. And it's going to be all in our futures. And I think we're all going to have to be savvy with it.
Dr. Lemery, thank you very much. I'm calling in from Melbourne in Australia. It was a fantastic talk. And I wanted to ask you, because I mentor a lot of medical students, are any of the educational opportunities you've mentioned available to international students or physicians to take part in? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So COVID's put a corkscrew in a bunch of stuff, but we hope that our climate fellowships that we run, physician fellowships, and they're for people out of residency, we're going to start this summer. And yes, they're open to international because they're not going to be Denver dependent. So you can ping me offline and I can tell you a little bit more about that. And then we have a medical student elective, which you can get through VSAS, which international students can take, although I think it's trickier because it's run by the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I don't know exactly the policies. I think there's a fee. I just don't know. And but that can be found on VSAS as well. And then we're going to start to stand up a lot of outreach stuff with again, our website. I actually have a meeting Friday to look at our new website, which isn't up yet. It's the Climate and Health Program at the University of Colorado. So I guess the answer is maybe, and hopefully more. And I'd be delighted to talk to you in details about if you want to just send me an email.
Thank you.
We're about 5 minutes over. If anybody has any last minute burning questions that they want to ask, this will be your chance, just so I can be respectful of everybody's time. And if not, if you think of some later, feel free to email them to me. I can get them to Dr. Lemery. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Again, Dr. Lemery, thank you for your amazing talk. That was truly inspirational. I truly enjoyed it, and I think I can speak on behalf of everybody here. Everyone, thank you for coming. I will miss you guys all next week. Hope you guys have a great break. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.